Emmanuel Levinas's Otherwise Than Being or Beyond Essence, Autrement qu'être ou au-delà de l'essence, 1974, is a profound continuation and radicalization of themes introduced in his earlier masterpiece, Totality and Infinity, 1961. In this later work, Levinas deepens his exploration of ethics, responsibility, and subjectivity by developing a philosophical language that attempts to escape the traditional metaphysical framework grounded in ontology, the study of being. Instead of defining the human being in terms of rational selfhood or essence, Levinas insists on the primacy of ethical responsibility to the other, where the other is not merely another self, but the infinite demand made by the face of another human being. 1. The departure from ontology. One of the foundational moves in Otherwise Than Being is Levinas's critique of the Western philosophical tradition's prioritization of ontology. He argues that Western metaphysics, from Plato through Heidegger, has generally subordinated ethics to being. In Levinas's terms, philosophy has typically sought to comprehend, categorize, and totalize reality into knowable structures. This impulse to reduce all alterity to sameness, all otherness to the same, is what he calls the violence of ontology. Levinas's response is radical. He seeks to develop a philosophical language that resists this reduction, and instead acknowledges the irreducibility of the other. Rather than conceiving the self as a knowing subject first, Levinas insists that the self is constituted by ethical responsibility. The subject is for the other before it is for itself. In this way, Otherwise Than Being attempts to speak from the place beyond being, where responsibility and ethical relation are prior to any ontological structure. 2. Saying and said. One of the most central and innovative concepts in Otherwise Than Being is Levinas's distinction between the saying, le dire, and the said, le dit. This distinction allows Levinas to explore how communication is always already ethical before it is linguistic or informational. The said refers to the fixed content of discourse, the propositions, the thematized content, the statements that can be analyzed and repeated. It belongs to the realm of ontology, the realm of language as a system of signs and meanings. The saying, by contrast, is the act of exposure, the relational gesture of turning toward the other. It is the self's vulnerability and openness, its offering of itself before the other. The saying is not reducible to what is said. It is the very condition of ethical communication. In this distinction, Levinas attempts to show that ethics is not something added onto discourse, but is embedded in its very structure. Every time we speak, we expose ourselves to others. In this exposure, we assume responsibility, even if we are unaware of it. 3. Subjectivity as responsibility. Perhaps Levinas's most radical philosophical gesture is his reconceptualization of subjectivity. In contrast to the Cartesian cogito, I think, therefore I am, or Heidegger's Dasein, being there, Levinas proposes that subjectivity is constituted by an infinite, preconscious responsibility to the other. He calls this substitution. Substitution is the idea that the self is not primarily a sovereign, autonomous being, but rather one who is already answerable for others. This is not a reciprocal relationship. The subject is uniquely responsible for the other in a way that cannot be transferred or shared. The other is not just someone else. It is the one who places me under obligation. In Otherwise Than Being, Levinas describes this as the self's being hostage to the other. The metaphor of hostage is crucial. The self is taken, exposed, wounded by the other's vulnerability. It is this ethical interruption that breaks the flow of ontology and introduces the non-symmetrical relation of ethics. 4. Language and ethics. Levinas' concern with the saying and the said leads to a complex meditation on language. Unlike philosophers who see language primarily as a means of representing reality, e.g. analytic philosophers, Levinas insists that language is first and foremost an ethical act. To speak is to offer oneself. To listen is to welcome the other. This welcoming, for Levinas, precedes the cognitive or descriptive function of language. Even before we understand what is being said, we are already ethically implicated in the fact that someone is speaking to us. The act of listening itself becomes a mode of ethical responsiveness. This ethical dimension of language is what Levinas calls proximity. Proximity and the face of the other. Levinas's notion of proximity is central in Otherwise Than Being. Proximity does not mean spatial closeness or physical distance. It refers to an ethical immediacy, an encounter that cannot be reduced to representation or perception. The proximity of the other is the condition of ethical obligation. I am near enough to be responsible, to be affected, to be called. This ties back to one of Levinas's earlier key concepts, the face of the other, le visage. The face is not primarily a physical feature, but a metaphor for the ethical demand the other places on me. To see the face of the other is to be commanded, "Thou shalt not kill." It is a non-verbal, pre-thematic injunction. In Otherwise Than Being, the concept of the face is extended through the discussion of substitution and the saying, "The face calls me, wounds me, obliges me, and I cannot escape this call." My identity is formed not through autonomy or self-consciousness, but through passivity, exposure, and responsibility. 6. The trace of God. Levinas is often seen as a religious thinker, and indeed, Otherwise Than Being is saturated with theological overtones. However, his approach is not doctrinal. The term God in Levinas does not refer to a being among beings, or even to a transcendent creator in the traditional sense. Rather, God is the trace of the infinite in the finite, the ethical imperative that can never be fully comprehended. God, for Levinas, is the origin of ethical demand, and also the impossibility of total knowledge. The face of the other is the trace of God, not in a mystical sense, but in the sense that it transcends our categories, disturbs our totalities, and obliges us infinitely. To be ethical is to live in response to this trace, this interruption of totalization. 7. Beyond Essence, Ethics as First Philosophy. Levinas's subtitle, Beyond Essence, is an explicit rejection of Heidegger's central philosophical concern, being. Levinas's project can thus be read as an inversion of the Heideggerian enterprise. Where Heidegger sought to uncover the meaning of being through fundamental ontology, Levinas argues that philosophy must move beyond being to ethics. This leads to one of his most important claims. Ethics is first philosophy. This means that the ethical relationship is not one domain among others, but is the condition for all meaningful human experience. Before there is being, knowledge, or history, there is the responsibility to the other. Levinas's language in Otherwise Than Being is intentionally difficult as he seeks to unwrite metaphysics. He employs neologisms, complex syntax, and paradoxical formulations to prevent the reader from falling back into the habits of traditional ontology. His prose performs the very ethical disorientation he describes. 8. Legacy and Influence. Otherwise Than Being has had a profound impact on contemporary philosophy, particularly in the fields of continental ethics, theology, and deconstruction. Jacques Derrida, who was Levinas's friend and interlocutor, saw in Levinas a powerful example of how philosophy can respond to the limits of metaphysics. Levinas also influenced feminist theory, notably Luce Irigaray, political theory, and post-Holocaust theology. His insistence on asymmetrical responsibility, vulnerability, and the ethical priority of the other resonates deeply in discussions of justice, human rights, hospitality, and trauma. In a world increasingly dominated by instrumental rationality and depersonalized systems, Levinas offers a humanizing counterpoint, the call of the other as the foundation of meaning. Conclusion. Emmanuel Levinas's Otherwise Than Being is not merely a critique of ontology. It is a radical reimagining of subjectivity, language, and ethics. By placing responsibility before cognition, the saying before the said, and the other before the self, Levinas proposes a philosophical vision in which ethics becomes the ground of all human existence. Though notoriously difficult in style, the work remains a touchstone for any serious engagement with the ethical dimension of philosophy, and with the irreducible singularity of the human face that calls us to be otherwise than being.